Welcome back to another episode of the Cycle Breakers podcast. Today, I am joined by a very special guest whom I am sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. I have Bob Joseph, the president and CEO of Indigenous Corporate Training Incorporated, who has provided training on Indigenous relations since 1994. He has assisted thousands of individuals and organizations in building Indigenous relations. He is also the author of 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act and 21 Things You Need to Know About Indigenous Self-Government. He is an initiated member of the Hamatsa Society and has inherited a chief seat in the Gayaxala Thunderbird clan. I might have mispronounced that. The first clan of the Gwawa'enuxw, one of the 18 tribes that make up the Kwakwaka'wakw. His chief name is Gayaxala, which loosely translated means whale who emerges itself from the water and presents itself to the world. And I just want to say that I love how you have provided these really easy to digest, to pronounce as best as we possibly can, because I imagine that it still needs a lot of refinement and tweaking, but I appreciate that you've included that for those of us who do not speak your native language. So please welcome warmly Bob Joseph to the podcast. Thank you, Miigwech, for being here.
Miigwech.
So I'd like you to start by introducing yourself and in your own words, taking us as far back as you want, so that we can get a glimpse into earlier life for you and what's led you to where you're now at today, because it's quite an impressive journey.
Okay, I can totally do that. But how long is this podcast? So 65 million years? No, just teasing. So I live here on the West Coast. I was born in a community called Alert Bay, which is actually in one of our neighboring tribes' territory, because our tribe, the Gwawa'enuxw Nation, comes from a place called the Broughton Archipelago, and our homelands are on Watson Island and what we call Hagums, and we don't have a central hospital because we don't have many people. I don't think we have any people living on our reserve now. We're all urban people. There's not much infrastructure. The band I come from is less than 50 people, so quite small, quite remote. And so being born in Alert Bay, that was the central hospital, even though that is in Indigenous Nation territory. Pardon me. And so I was born there. We lived in a bunch of different places as I grew up. My dad moved us to Vancouver, to Mount Currie, or to the Gwawa'enuxw Nation. We lived on reserve there. Before my memory, I've got maybe one or two memories of that time. And then we moved to Cape Mudge, Weewakai territory, Lichwiltok territory, as they say. Where he worked as a band manager for Indian Affairs, and that was where I think I would have to say I grew up there. That was the land of the misspent youth, and trying to figure out who I was and where I am and where I want to go. I was initiated into the Hamatsa Society in the early 1980s. My dad's a hereditary chief, Kwakwaka'wakw, and he initiated us there because that's really close to our homelands, where we don't have a big house or even houses today. And they're definitely, we consider them homelands, though. So so we've been potlatching throughout my whole life. My dad's been potlatching. He's the chief. He hosts our potlatches, and we haven't done very many of them, but he's been really active in potlatching overall, and as has the family. And for those that don't know what potlatching is, it's described loosely as a gift-giving ceremony. So in our way, we, how we gain rank, anthropologists describe us as a rank or hierarchy society. We didn't move around a whole bunch because we could live on the bank of a river or the mouth of a river, and there'd be enough fish and marine resources and animals and all of that kind of stuff to help us live where we lived, and we didn't have to move around a whole bunch. But and part of our customs and culture, we evolved into this gift-giving society, and to gain rank in Kwakwaka'wakw culture, you have to give away your wealth. And I can remember that conversation with my dad the first time. He said, "Hey, I was getting into early teens. He said, you better keep going to school so you can get a good job and make lots of money so you can give it all away." And I was like, no way, man. I'm gonna work hard for that money. And I understand it now, but back then it was like, it was relatively new concept. And so I spent a lot of time worrying about how do I get a good job and make lots of money so I can give it all away. And I'm looking forward to hosting my first potlatch in August of this year. I've tried two or three times already, but we have lots of cultural protocols. And the one that I have struggled with personally is if a loved one passes close to your event, you're supposed to postpone. You're not supposed to do anything like that. You're not supposed to do what we call business and celebration, and or so we're supposed to give a bit of time and then do a memorial. So two or three times I've hit the threshold where I'm thinking it's going to happen, and somebody's passed away. The first time it was a hunt, actually. I was wondering if we were related, who passed away. My mom's mom was a hunt, my granny Elizabeth Hunt. Um, Anyways, her granddaughter would have passed away, and so I went to my mom and I said, what do you want me to do? And she said, yeah, you need to postpone. And I said, okay, we'll postpone, and we put word out in the community, and then that required waiting for a year. Then the pandemic hit, and that required waiting for 3 years, and then there's been a couple other passings. So it'll happen when it'll happen, and you know, um, it's a bit of a struggle. Like all communities, we're wrestling with the fentanyl crisis, and that's probably the one that if I look down the horizon, I'm like, oh gosh, that's just any minute now, not any day, any minute. And so it's part of the process. And the more you give away, though, in our potlatch culture, the higher your rank, and the more you have the right to speak for people. In our form of governance, um, um, we uh, we believe it's a better political system. How's that for some perspective, right? And we believe it's a better political system because we're in it for the good of the people. We have to distribute our wealth. We're not in it for personal gain. And so that's why we look at the world the way we do, and we really try to lift our families and our communities up when we're doing our potlatch activity. Of course, potlatching was banned up until 1951, part of Canada's assimilation policy. Some of our chiefs went to jail practicing potlatching, had their regalia removed, and it would end up in public displays like museums, where it was often listed as, acquired, or, some very euphemist collected. That was the term. I would go into the collections in the 80s, and I would see something and it would say, Kwakwaka'wakw mask, collected 1929. And I'd be like, yeah, it wasn't collected. It was confiscated. And people went to jail, and they're trying to get that stuff back. And fortunately, many, not all, but many museums have been cooperating and have been repatriating things that were collected during the prohibition of potlatching. And of course, it didn't just apply to us. The prohibition on potlatching went after sun dances and powwows, and just every cultural ceremony sort of fell under the umbrella. And so a very aggressive effort, a for those of you that have read 21 Things, you may not know about the Indian Act to forcibly culturally assimilate, and really leads us into 21 things you should know about self-government, because that's really, if I were aspiring like all the other nations who have been through a through a how would I best describe this, through a legacy of forced cultural assimilation, and you really want to break the cycle. I think it requires us to all reflect and look back. What did we have? Is it worth going back to? What do we have now? Is it okay? Is it working? And to me, that's a whole conversation about self-government. And the world, Canada is a signatory to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And we, if we look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it says in its some of its principles, free, prior, and informed consent. And when we consider the free piece, we're supposed to be free to decide who our leaders are. They must be freely chosen. So if I can make that a buzzword with your listeners, um, you know, freely chosen. That's what we're after. And if that happens to be a band council, I think you still need to go through a process to freely choose that. If it happens to be a traditional government, you just got to go through a process to freely choose that. If it's a blend of both of those things, you've got to go through a process. If you haven't, you're still, you're still living with a very strong colonial legacy. Band governance, was never designed to um, look after lands and resources and water and all of that stuff. It was designed as part of an assimilation process. Their job was healthcare, housing, and education until you assimilated. And now when I look at some of the big conversations, we're still consulting with colonial institutions, and they're it's concerning, because I think we have this opportunity to freely choose who should be consulted, but we're still reaching out to the AFN and really national indigenous organizations that they're quite far removed from the peoples and the lands and their territories. So um, I went to school in Campbell River. I graduated from Camosun College in 1988. I studied business administration. That was my philosophy at that time. Was I didn't know what I wanted to do, probably like a lot of people. And so I thought I've got to be able to find a job, and if I can't find a job, I've got to be able to run a business. So I thought, I'm going to take business administration. That hedges my bets and gives me lots of options. And so I took business, and I quite enjoy business. I run a company called Indigenous Corporate Training now. We do Indigenous awareness training and working effectively with Indigenous peoples training. We help people consult and engage. We try to show them a way that is beyond the very basic duty to consult, rights and title consultation that the Crown often utilizes to try to get permits, going faster. And then we do employment and procurement and negotiation. So we have a bunch of courses, and I learned all of that stuff from um, some work that I did for a company called BC Hydro. And I joined BC Hydro. I was still living in Campbell River at the end of my misspent youth, and my wife had graduated from law school, and was having to go to Vancouver to article. And she's non-Indigenous, but I realized if we want to stay married, I kind of got to go with her. And at that time, I was a sports fishing guide, taking people salmon fishing. And I bumped into a hydro person who I thought was like one of the power line technicians, the guys that do the wires, and so I thought that's who I had in the boat, and but he was turned out he was a senior human resources manager with 26 direct reports, and just half the company of employees under his responsibility. And he hired me to do budgets and management plans, and then I moved around to customer services, talking to that happy 2% of our customers that didn't think we are doing such a great job. um, I moved into advertising and display. So I was getting a really good feel for, probably a good medium size, medium to large company with 6,500 employees. But I bumped into a manager for Indigenous relations. Then it would have been called Aboriginal relations. And I didn't even know those kinds of things existed. And we talked briefly outside of some elevators, and she at the end of the sort of the elevator doors closing, she said, "We should talk. Well, how would you feel about putting on presentations to the employees?" And I said, "Sure." That sounded better than the financial accounting stuff that I was working on, and it was certainly about a time for a change. And um, a few weeks later, I end up in her department, the Aboriginal Relations Department. I'm hired on as a Aboriginal cross-cultural awareness trainer. That was the title, and my job was just to train hydro people on Aboriginal people and issues. But more importantly, they really needed to know the business case. Hydro had figured it out in the early 90s that in the future, if anything was going to be built, it was going to have to go through First Nations. They were going to be an important part of the conversation. And so my job was to roll it into this cross-cultural training and present it as here's the history, here's the business case, and here's what we want to do, and here's some things that you can do individually to help us with this Aboriginal relations strategy that Cheryl had put together. She was the manager for Aboriginal relations. She had it adopted by the board of directors, a statement of principles. So one of the really neat things I felt that she did was, rather than try to pick off individual policy, we'll work on employment policy, and working on policy in a corporation of that size is complicated. It takes 2, 3 years to get a policy through. And she figured out, if I can get a statement of principles in place that deals with employment and procurement and consultation and negotiations, and if I can get the board of directors to approve that, then that's all the policy I need. And so we had a statement of principles. I was to tell our employees about that, and so I started training. I think by the time I'd left, we had talked to, there were other trainers, had talked to over 4,700 hydro employees. They were um, what I would call tough sessions. In the beginning, talking to largely non-Indigenous people. Well, think about a company like BC Hydro. They were middle-aged to old-age engineers, mostly men, and didn't sort of fall into the POC category. So that was interesting, learning how to talk to people about really sensitive issues, and trying different things. I'll respond with the anger and rage like they're talking to me, and that didn't work. And having to think through some of that stuff, and really, and my goal, and this is probably a really good nugget about the work that I do, is people don't respond to forcibly being told to do stuff, right? And but I've had lots of people, our people, say, "Hey, you got to take them into a dark place and lead them out of the process," and I'm like, but that didn't work with our residential school survivors. None of the beatings or any of the bad things happened. Changed, got the behavioral change, that they were looking for when they started those residential schools. If anything, it made them hardliner. So I sort of had this epiphany that like that's not the way to get through to people. So if I can learn how to talk about these issues and answer their questions with respect and humility, that they could actually start to empathize and would start to take on things on their own accord. If I tried to force them to do something and you know yelled at them harder and did all the things that happen in residential school, it just wasn't going to work. And so that was, for me, that was a big aha moment. And then it became, how do I deal with all of the emotion? When somebody's asking me about, I'm going through slides, and the one about taxation, because they always ask about Indian taxation. They're curious. They hear that nobody pays taxes, which is kind of untrue, or not totally true. There's a kernel of truth there, but the Métis people pay taxes, the Inuit people pay taxes, and or Inuit, pardon me, no people, my bad. And then if you're a status Indian, you can not pay taxes, but you have to work on a reserve and be paid on a reserve, So trying to sift through all that, but I could see that they would be getting emotional before I got to that, and I'm trying to figure out how do I keep them not emotional? Because I figured out if they were listening and engaging with the information and myself, that they were not emotional, we could really make progress. But as soon as they spazzed out. You don't pay taxes. You get free housing. As soon as they were there, you can't have a conversation. You're just yelling at each other, and it's not. You're not going to get anywhere. You might as well just quit and walk away because you're never going to change them. And so what I realized was I had to crack that nut. How do I talk about this stuff and not get emotional when I'm doing it? And what I realized was I can ask the questions first. Hey, I'm glad this next piece we're going to talk about taxation. And just so you know, I don't know if you ever heard the question, or it's not even a question, you guys don't pay taxes and, you get free housing. So I realized if I asked first, you could see them nod, but they wouldn't get emotional. I was like, perfect. That's where we need to be. So that became a key turning point in my career as a communications person, trying to get through to largely Canadians and mostly men at that time. And so to be able to do that made the job easy. And then by the end of the class, they were different people. They were like, huh, didn't know all of this. I got to think about it more. Some of them were, what do you want us to do? And that was the behavior that we were looking for in BC Hydro. They, when we think about trying to talk to Canadians about self-government, for example, there's a spectrum of response. There's no way we're not going to talk to you about it. There's neutral, I'm going to listen and think about it, and there's supportive. And every time I walked into a room, I thought, okay, we got three peoples here. These guys. There's somebody in here that's never gonna drink the Kool-Aid. There's a whole bunch of people here that are going to drink and listen, and then there's a bunch more people who will actually take action. I'm gonna work on trying to get somebody employed or try to do a business relationship or do a better job of consultation. And so that's what we were trying to do. And so I always remembered the onion in the middle. And people say, Bob, how come you didn't, like some of the questions you get just make me angry. I can't, I just go to this horrible place. And I would say, Rachel, when they ask me, they've done me a huge favor. They've opened the conversation. I don't have to respond to them. I need to respond to other people who will actually listen to the answer and give them some really solid information and try not to convince them. It's very hard to not try to convince you. You have to do this, right? Back to convincing. And we want to give them enough information so they can make their own decisions about what to do. That's the ideal thing. So I hope that's in line.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And thank you so much for, I mean, you answered a few questions already that I was going to ask, so that was perfect. I love how naturally and organically certain things flowed. And I think your approach is so brilliant. It disarms people. It puts their guard down because like you said, this can be quite sensitive. It is very sensitive subject matter, and there's all sorts of preconceived notions and unconscious biases and all of that in the mix. You get a whole spectrum, and for you to come in not guns a blazing, but just there to also share your information and to do so in a good way and with respect and humility, that garners that rapport where respect and humility can be again there's always someone that might want to be more challenging, but I think that's such a beautiful approach, and I really love how you touched on that. And there are so many layers to your story. First of all, the Hunt side of my family is my father, who is non-indigenous. My mom's side of the family, they're Joneses, originally Kegodons. That was the Anishinaabe name, and then the colonizer named us Jones. So would have been, we could have been related, but Hunt is the non-indigenous side. But the thing that I want to go, the place I want to go next is the differences that you've seen, the progression perhaps in Indigenous relations back in 1994, where you started in that work, to where it's at today. Where have you seen it advance, evolve, and where perhaps is there still room for improvement?
Yeah, when I started doing this work, I was working for BC Hydro, Crown Corporation, so I clearly crossed the floor, thinking of political terms. But the Stalo lady I was working for, she when I said agreed to work with her, I showed up at the office a couple of weeks later, and she came running out. She said, "Bob Joseph, come on in, have a seat," And there was already 28 people working there, and I sat down and she closed the door and she looked at me and it was just, uh, and up until this point, I'd honestly got to say, I just was following my dad's lead, get a job, get a good education so you can make lots of money to give away. And so, getting into hydro, I'm like, wow, utility, pension, medical, dental. I mean, just, it was, dream really, all through business school and and it opened a lot of doors and everything and so but it was just I was just on this path, be a good business person, and so I sat down with Cheryl and she's like, Bob Joseph, this is an incredible company, and her traditional name's Patalwit and mine's Aksam Malagalis, but she's like, Bob Joseph, this is an incredible company. It's got lots of power, and I'm not just talking about the stuff that comes out of the hole in the wall. She said, I'm talking about the political power, the economic power, the social power. This is a powerful company. It's omnipresent in society. All people see are the wires, but it is so influential, and and we're going to use it to do good things for our people, which was pretty mind blowing because I was just I'm just totally in the system. I'm not thinking about outside of it or having different perspective, and I'm like, wow, good things for our people working inside a company. I'd heard, I'd seen, some of the American Indian movement stuff and, some of those conversations. And anyway, she said, they don't know it yet, but we're gonna help them too. We're gonna help this company and we're gonna help our people and we're gonna get good things. And she said, and your job is going to be important because you're helping implement the statement of principles and you're going to talk to all of the people. There's going to be a communications piece behind you. We'll have a talking stick publication and we'll be talking to our employees and we're going to try and get them to do things that right now they would push back on. We want you to go consult better with them. So when I started, um, go consult with them would have got a lot of pushback, right? It would have got no way. Why do we don't do that for Chinese people? We don't do it for anybody else. Why should we do it for them? That was the pushback at that time. By the time I left, the conversations were, well, I don't know, but have we talked to the indigenous people yet? So you could see the change happening inside the organization, and and that was really important, to us to try to get that kind of positive headway. She did ask me to do consultation, Cheryl. It was a fun opportunity for me because you could get thrown into anything. There was so little experience in the corporation and so many problems, you know, power lines that we didn't have permission to be on reserve lands and flooding ancestral lands and it was just there's just no end to what would come at you. And so when you worked for her, I always joked with the new people who would come into the office and say, Rachel, don't go past Cheryl's office after 3 o'clock because you could be working on something completely different tomorrow. And so that happened. I forgot and walked past. Hey, Bob Joseph, can you come in here, please? And I go, and yes, Cheryl, how can I be of service? And she said, I got some vegetation managers from power lines going to talk to the XYZ community next week, and I want you to go with them. They don't have a clue. You need to help them. You need to get them started on a good foot. And I said, okay, Cheryl, I haven't done consultation before, but if you want me to do that, I'll do that. I would like to drop what you've got me working on right now, though, so I can just focus on this because it was next week, right? We're talking next Wednesday. And I said, Cheryl, if I have any legal questions, because I'm sure it's a legal thing, would you mind if I taught Hydro had its own rights and title lawyer? And she said, no, if you have to do that too, fine. And so I spent the whole week doing research on the community. What do we need to know about this community? Because it was different from mine, totally different people, and similar lifestyle, similar territory, totally different language and culture, and had to factor in those cultural differences, and then took a look at the legal stuff. And by the end of the week, I had two questions, legally questions. One, what the heck is BC Hydro? Right? And I never even thought to ask that before, but is it a for-profit commercial entity or is it a crown corporation? Because that would make a difference in how our people should approach the community. The crown has a duty to consult. We don't, as a crown corporation. We'd taken that position at that time that it's the crown's duty and we're just, something of it, but they have the duty. They're approving our permits. And so we're going to take that approach. So yeah, we had to get what the heck was BC Hydro, and and the then the other question was, I looked at the guidelines for consultation because I'd never done it before. So I went to the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. So there's a little denotation for you. It went from Aboriginal Affairs to Indigenous Relations in my career. That's a pretty significant, one's very reactionary, the other's very, forward thinking and trying to get ahead of things. And but it said send, there was a flow chart. I'm like, here we go, consultation, Aboriginal Affairs, send letter to band, wait 30 days, no response, go to permitting. And then that was the flow chart. You could jump all through all the steps. If the band didn't respond to you in 30 days, and that was the instructions from government to not just all government employees, but forest companies and mining companies and and uh, and then if they did respond, try to set up meeting that had two or three steps in between, and try to find concerns um, and so that was in the beginning of my career. That's what it looked like. I'm like, wow, this is, if I were a manager that was smart and I had lots of things to do, I'd send 160 of these requests for consultation, for vegetation management, for road work, I'd just do it all at once. I'd paper blizzard you. If I wasn't supportive of our Aboriginal Relations Department, I'd just hit you with 150 of them. And if you didn't respond to any of them, I'm good to go. I got the green light here, right? And so in my mind, that's just not proper. We've got to try to talk to folks, and that's the way the law was shaping out. Delgamuukw, this would have been 1995. Delgamuukw was still 2 years away, which is a landmark court case. Delgamuukw and Giskewe, a couple of hereditary chiefs from the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en peoples, and by the time that decision came out, I mean, it was a game changer. Now they had to go and talk, and they had to try to get concerns, and um, you know, um, and our training was actually helpful. We're trying to explain this to people. Here's the history. Now take a look at this legal piece. If we get this wrong, we end up in court cases, which means we can't develop as fast as we want to. And when you understand project managers, Rachel, and how they live and die by Gantt charts and cost overruns and stuff like that, I could talk to those people. So, Rachel, if you don't do a good job of consulting them, you're going to get a permit that says you can do your bridge upgrade. But what's going to happen if they don't like it? If they decide to, they can ask the court to do a judicial review of your consultation process. And that's fine. And what that means is the judges, not government who's approving your permit, the judges will look at the adequacy and meaningfulness of your consultation. And they'll go through every meeting note, every text message, every email, every whatever, they're going to go through it all, listen to it all. And what they're going to do is they're just going to see if you missed anything. And it's just how the law works. But it's going to take 3 to 5 years to go through a judicial review, which means, Rachel, you're the project manager. You're going to have to wait for that to happen. So you're not a very good project manager because you're taking us out 3 to 5 years. And on a $500 million project, the project delay fees are $5-6 million a month if they miss their deadlines, right? And so if now I can talk to a project manager, Rachel. So if you're hearing me and they judicially review you after you get the permit from the Crown, you're sitting there, if their lawyers are lousy, you're sitting there for 3 years, that's 36 months times 5 million a month, that's 180 million in cash. Or we can do a better job in the first place and hear their concerns and address them and work with them on procurement and employment because there's probably going to be impacts and we've got to, you know, and Delgamook eventually said compensation is normally required. And so we figured out, with the help of guys like Gibby Jacob from the Squamish Nation, former chief counselor, but also a hereditary chief, told me this whole judicial review piece. And once I understood that, I could talk to any business, any government, and say, there's the easy way and the hard way. The easy way is to go talk to them first. So today there's a big meeting in Prince Rupert. The Prime Minister is going to meet with coastal First Nations. So we've gone from send letter to band, wait 30 days to prime ministers coming to talk to the coastal chiefs and it's ahead of there's not even a proposed project on the books. They want one,
Wow.
right? So what I have seen, and maybe the grassroots people without a lot of knowledge or history or legal perspective or whatever it is that they would need, is that we've gone from no political power to nothing's getting built without talking to us. We can't always stop it, and a lot of communities have figured out that we don't really want to. We need these opportunities. I can remember I had this. I was doing a book reading in Toronto, and I had an activist come up, and it actually took the first question after I did a reading on my talk, which was before I'd written 21 Things You Need to Know About Self-Government, and because I was testing the idea, and she said, I don't like pipelines, and I don't like this, and I don't like that, and I said, and I thanked her for her question. I said, I appreciate you coming here tonight. This is my whole background is that I've worked in that stuff, so I can't, my opinion would not matter. It will be different. And I said, so all I can really do is try to address what you've said to me. And I said, Canada's a resource development country, and it is, it still does happen without us, but we can get involved. And I think I said to this young lady, I think we need to, because right now we're part of um, this system, the Indian Act system, and we're trying to break that cycle. That's our problem. We're in this cycle of dependency. Calvin Lean talked about it, notable Indigenous author, talked about dances with dependency. So if you're a band and a band member living on a reserve, or, I mean, you're just in it, man. I mean, this is the matrix. The 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 blue pill says the Indian Affairs and Indian Act legislation is going to help us. The red pill's not that at all. We'll show you how deep the rabbit hole really goes. And I said, so if we don't do all of that stuff, then we're making a decision to stay in that cycle of dependency. And I said, to me, for me, that personally is tough to do because I've got tons of relatives. I lose them to fentanyl. It's sad. I can go to the downtown east side and see relatives and feel safe down there. And, I'm just like, we have to do something about that. And unfortunately, no development means no economic control, no say over programs and services, and continued we just saw with the new Carney government, they cut $2.7 billion. So if you've got a housing problem now, if you're a status Indian listening to this, it just got $2.7 billion worse. When I started doing the awareness training in 90, 94, 95, 51% lived off reserve and 49% lived on reserve. Today, that number on average across the country is 60-40. Indian Affairs, its job, the Indian Act, and why I hope we can break that cycle. Its job is to get us off the reserve. It's not there to help you. It's not there to service you. It's still struggling with, all of that stuff. And so when I think about all of that, I'm like, and talking to this young lady, I said, you have to think about that. That's your job. I said, I'm actually getting old. I told her in front of all the people that were there. I'm actually getting old. I maybe got 20 more years of fight. You've got 40. And so if you decide no to all of that development, that's a great decision. But you've got to step up now. How are you going to help those people? How are you going to help those people that are being cycled off of the reserve? How are you going to break that cycle of pushing people off the homelands and crushing economic, socio indicators, higher levels of incarceration, because that's what you're going to get. That's the result of your decision to not do any of this. And I said, where I would come from on that is we can still do this, but we got to protect the water and, you know, we will do it to a different standard. It's not development. And we've heard that message from Indigenous leadership for decades now. We're not against development, but it can't be development at all costs. We're going to keep living and doing what we're doing. We're going to make you work hard to find a sweet spot for us to do that. And then that opens the door to the possibility of participating in developments. And some communities are, they're super strong. I think about Ontario and Hydro One. I mean, there's, I can't remember, 58, 68 First Nations are owners. They got equity in Hydro One, the power line business, and that kicks back millions of dollars a year to the community who can do something about fentanyl problems and housing and healthcare and education and culture and language and all of the things that are important. So it's like, it was just, it was a great conversation. And afterwards on the walkout, she sort of caught up to me and she said, I just want to thank you. You really made me think. I said, yeah, we're both we're both in the same cause. We're trying to help the people, but we have to, if we have to think about how we're doing that in the cycle of dependency. It's the first thing we've got to break. And we can, moving to governance could mean we could get into taxation. Many Jules, who I call the tax man for Indians in Canada, he's been trying to get a bill through Parliament for a number of sessions now, but it keeps dying on the order paper. Where there would be a 5% First Nations resource tax. I think that's what it's called. It's in the book. I should have looked at it and paid attention to that detail. It's been a while since I picked up the book, about 2 months anyway. And but he's been trying to get it through Parliament, and that money would go to the First Nation to use to programs, services, whatever they wanted to do with, which, when you're getting Indian Affairs money, that you got to spend it the way they want you to spend it. It's on priorities that are decided by someone else, often without talking to you. And they're still struggling with drinking water problems and moldy houses, and that stuff isn't going away. And so
Yes.
we need to really think about how do we break that cycle,
Yeah.
get into the conversation and you know be the nation to nation relationship. If you're a treaty person, that's what you have, a nation to nation relationship. Right now, you're subjugated under the Indian Act.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And actually, I think that's again, you so beautifully touched on multiple things that I wanted to ask anyway. So it's just so divine how organic and natural the conversation's flowing. But you're such a wealth of knowledge, and like anyone who is listening who has not yet read, firstly, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, great place to start, because there were a lot of pieces of information within that I did not know. Some I did, but it so beautifully breaks down key components of the Indian Act, which is complex. And you so beautifully break it down into a far simpler and easier to digest way. Whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, it's a must read. And then let's go into 21 things you need to know about self-government. And let's talk about, before we wrap up the conversation, let's start talking about ways to break the cycle of dependency, because I think that is the piece that landed the most for me in that book. And yeah, I know we're getting close on time, so whatever you feel compelled to share about how we can begin to break that cycle of dependency.
First of all, I'd love to ask you, and I know this is flipping the script a little bit. What resonated with you? What did what did you sort of take away from?
So what's interesting is because a number of my clients, so I work predominantly with Indigenous women, and a number of my clients are actually from the Yukon Territory, Northwest Territories, and actually British Columbia. And a number of nations, in fact, are perhaps all the First Nations in Yukon Territory self-governing. So that conversation had begun coming up just naturally. And then I started getting kind of curious about that, because I'm not a political person, and I don't really know a lot about self-governance. And I then started to get curious about what that meant and what that could look like. And every time I've gone to the Yukon, and every conversation I have, they have this different mentality around resources, this different outlook on prosperity and success. We hear Indigenous success and prosperity all the time. And yet there's a key difference I notice coming from Ontario, being an Indigenous Anishinaabe woman from Ontario, and just noticing the differences between, yeah, we're having similar conversations, but one feels like it's really like rooted and taking root and like growing, and there's action to follow it. And here it just feels like a conversation. It just feels like we're talking in circles. And anyway, so that's really, as I was reading the book, I kept considering these notions of what self-governance and self-government looks like in nations that I'm familiar with, not my First Nation, and what that could look like. What that could look like for the future of my community, for the future of all of our communities. So that's, yeah. And then I really love the case studies. Last January, actually a year ago, I was in Florida, and my friends were like, oh, you got to check out the Seminole tribe. They're everywhere. But I was on the other side. So I was on the Tampa Bay side. And the Seminole tribe of Florida is based in Hollywood, Florida, as you would know. But that case study, I did not realize how successful they were as a tribe. And again, because I had kind of this indirect connection somewhat to the Seminole tribe, like a personal kind of experience with being familiar with the tribe, that case study really stood out. And again, a number of the case studies that you broke down. So I know that kind of went in 5 different directions. As you can see, there were multiple aspects that resonated with me. But it really got me thinking of what this could look like. What does this mean for our future? For sovereignty, for what I'm going to say, true Indigenous success and prosperity. Because right now, relying on government funding is, and I've seen this, and I don't speak openly on it because it's something that I don't feel confident to speak up on, but it's something that I feel is, as long as we are dependent on these I'm going to say handouts in quotations, but this funding, we are still focusing and living in the problem. We're not actually creating and living in solutions. That's my take.
I like it. I like it. Thank you for that.
But
That really helps me think about your audience and yeah, the Yukon NWT, those folks are awesome. They're so far ahead and they're fabulous. And they show us that it can be done. They plowed the road. They've made it easier. I mean, it wasn't easy for them, 20, 30-year agreements. And that was a piece that I was struggling when I was thinking about the Seminole story, right? And I think, one of the stats I say there's 25, 26 self-government agreements since 1982 with 45-ish First Nations, but there's over 600 of us. And so to me, that was that's a conundrum. Like, we're just going to have to wait our turn. I mean, it's 150 years of the Indian Act in 2026. And, 150 years to get 25 agreements when, you're going to need 100. So it's 153. You're 600 years out if you're at the bottom of the barrel, right? Or last on the list. And so, for me, and a large part of what drives our potlatching, and for all the other Indigenous people that I've ever met, we're always concerned about our people. We think collectively as opposed to individually, although we've largely inherited an individual society. Everything we do is individualistic. And so that's something that individuals of us have to reconcile with. But if you're thinking about the people, that's the right headspace. And for me, in that reconciliation journey, I got to be able to look after myself. If I want to help my nation, I've got to be able to look after myself. If I can do that, then I can become more useful. I can look for other opportunities. And that really was like a turning point for me, breaking the cycle. Look after myself first. Don't, band house and waiting for all of that stuff. I'll take advantage of whatever program is there, but I'm not waiting for it anymore. I'm not looking for it. I'm not waiting for it. If it pops up, I'll take advantage. And where and that is part of for the nations in the country who aren't like the Yukon fabulous people. They you know they think of the Indian Act today. There's this is the nation government here, and then the an Indian Act band councils, is kind of one of the things that the government looks after, and then they do healthcare and housing and education and economic development and natural resources, right? but many bands are still, we do all of that. We do lands and resources. They weren't even designed to do that. That's not what their purpose was. And so in the future, we hope that nations will be able to see themselves. Here's our nation. We're broken up into clans or families or whatever the social structure is, and uh, and it's our job to govern. So really, the band office becomes just one thing that they keep an eye on, and their territorial management another, their governance another, their economic development, and that's kind of, to me, that was the mental shift in the Seminole tribe story. And what really caught my attention, because I'm still deep in the business and business administration and learning, and we're on our way to the Magic Kingdom for the kids, those of you that haven't read the book. In Orlando, though, we're going to Florida, and a few days before we're heading down there, this announcement comes out, and the Seminole tribes, it's announced, and it's global news, like this is router stuff, right? The Seminole tribe of South Florida has just purchased the Hard Rock Cafe International gaming and food chain, $1 billion equity market transaction. And I'm like, man, that's the way to roll. Who are these? And so I said to Cindy, my wife, I said, can we take a day out of the Magic Kingdom and we'll just go to, I see they have a cultural center. They have a ecotourism outfit. They've got some things where we can go. And I just want to fish around a little bit. And she said, yeah, totally. It'd be good for the kids. And so we go to the cultural center first. We carve a day out of the Magic Kingdom and Disney World, and then go to the cultural center. And I decide to sign in with my traditional name. Just seeing if they're paying attention, hoping that they are really desperately in some sense. I signed, Kaxam Malagalis, and And they did have somebody looking at the people signing in. A young person ran over, looked at it, ran into the back, came out with a manager. And he came running over. Hey, you an Indian? I said, because Gwawa'enuxw Nation, obviously, we moved away from Indian thanks to one of my aunties, Auntie Elsie, who was decided we should be a tribe. We're not Indians. We're going to be a tribe. That's a colonizer thing, Indian. And so we kind of made that kind of little mental transition. And I said, yeah, you could call me that. And he's like, you want a tour? I said, I'd love one. So, backstage, Seminole Tribe cultural tour with, one of their folks. And he said, what do you want to know? We're kind of in the back room going through things. He's pointing out stuff. And I said, well, I want to know just some basic stuff. I said, how many Seminole tribal members do you have? And he said, 1,200. I said, 1,200. I said that, I come from a community of less than 50. So, I mean, we're quite a bit smaller, but 1,200 is not that far up above us either. I said, you guys just bought the Hard Rock, right? And he said, yes. Yeah, we did. And I said, $1 billion. Did I hear correctly? And he's like, yeah, we bought it, $1 billion. 985, GB. Close enough. I said, close enough. And I said, I'm curious. How does a community of 1,200 people spend $1 billion on the stock market to buy a gambling and food chain? Like, how do you do that? If I could do that for our 50 people, I mean, we would our culture is going to make it. And he said, you know, we in 1980, he gave me it was I can't remember if it was 82 or 83, but he said in 1983 we're sitting around the tribal council table. So they have tribal councils, we have band councils, different Canadian US terminology. Sitting around the tribal council table realizing that if we're going to wait for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we have a Department of Indian Affairs, um, who now do business as Indigenous Services Canada and CERNAC. But that's important distinction. Doing business as the real name still underneath it all is Department of Indian Affairs. And but he said if we're going to wait for the Bureau to look after us, we're not going to make it as a people. And I said, we're in the same boat. We're not going to make it as a people. If we're waiting for the Bureau to look after our families and our communities, yeah, we're not going to do that. He said, based on that sort of, realization, we decided we needed to get into the game. And to me, I took that as get into business because that's what followed next. I said, so how'd you get into the game? He said, we didn't really have anything. We were totally reliant, dependent, and we had really, nothing that could help us immediately. But we just decided we're going to do bingo. Our people like to bingo, and so we did a bingo night. Managed to raise a bit of money. Thought, hey, this is pretty good. Let's do another night. So we started doing 2 nights, 3 nights. Next thing you know, it's 7 nights a week, and it's bringing in revenue. And their whole goal is to help the people, right? And then we saw a neighboring community come up with a bingo palace for sale. So we reached out to the bank. We do this. We're in this business. Would you lend us some money? And they bought that business. They bought another bingo palace, another bingo. Then they found an old casino that was kind of off the beaten track and could use some attention. And they thought we could drive our business with the bingo palaces to the casino, and and so in my mind, it was like, holy cow, they monopolied their way to $1 billion of equity market transaction, and the and I thought, and it was just a decision. That was the simplicity of it. They just decided we're not going to make it, and we have to do something. And I thought that is simple enough that I've got to start thinking about that you know, got to start thinking about it like this. We're not going to wait for the Bureau to come and do a self-government agreement that takes 25 years and endless changes in government and, that kind of stuff, right? And so they continue to do stuff. I asked them about their other businesses. They had an aggregates business, and it has just fueled everything they do. And And so when I think about your audience, and I thank you for telling me that you work with ladies, I think I was called in to talk to a community. They're getting close to signing a treaty, and they were asking me because I'd worked for the Crown. What do you think of what do you think of our treaty? And I said, first of all, I don't think anything of it. I think it's your treaty, and whatever you've got in there and you agreed to it, negotiated and agreed, that's that's really your business. So you don't need my opinion on what I think of your treaty. I said, I will say though that you're, you're not really negotiating the settlement. The settlement was decided before you started. You're going to get land and cash. You can have all land, all cash, or a combination of land and cash, but that number that you settled on, that was already decided before you started. And so I want to point that out to you, just so we know what we're dealing with here. I said, you compare to other treaties, you're a fourth the size, you're going to get about a fourth the payment and about a fourth the size of land that they got. If and and it's been sort of documented and talked about that it appears to be a very formula-driven process by Indian Affairs. And so I said, that's first of all, let's do that. And I said, so you have housing problems. I imagine a lot of the ladies that you work with, if they're not on the reserve, live on, in urban centers, and in Vancouver, it's low cost native housing and that kind of stuff, rough neighborhoods and, unsafe. It leads to missing and murdered Indigenous women and all of those problems, right? The same thing I told that young girl who said, I hate pipelines and hate mines. And um, so it's, that's definitely a challenge in terms of that. I said with with the money settlement, I said, here's the number I think you're going to get. With that money, how many houses do you think you could buy in this neighborhood? And I knew the prices were, kind of a low old fixer upper, 750 grand to 2 million, 3 million, golf course houses very close by. And I said, it's they said 50, 60. I said, so that's why I don't have an opinion on your treaty and will it solve your problems? And and if you can live with it, that's great. All the power to you. I respect your decision, what you have to do in your circumstances right now. That's you, and you're making a good decision. And I did say, what was your housing waiting list? And they told me it was close to 200. And I said, so, I'll let you think about all of that. That it's, you know, it is something for you to think about. And I said, you're going to get some portion of land that'll take you, the Niska signed their agreement in 2002. They're pushing for a I don't know, some kind of bitumen plant or something on their territory. So that's 20, 25 years to develop something that could really start to contribute to the nation, right? So I said that's going to be another challenge. So, well, it seems like a big number that, the reality is it solves very little of your problem right now. And they said, well, what do you think we could do? I said, well, I said, I'm going to give you an answer, but you have to let me finish. So the longer I talk, the more sense it's going to make, but you're going to push back too. Because you've got a cultural mindset that might push back a little bit. And I said, but let me start telling you. I said, one of the things the nation could do right now is, you've already got employment programs and training programs. You might even have businesses. I said, you know, one of the things I do because I've never had the ability to live on a reserve is buy a house outside of the reserve for one of your people to live in. I've lived in non-reserve housing my whole life, and my first house I paid 250,000, sold it for 550, bought another one for 899 and sold it for 1.3 million, and I never changed the $1,500 a month payment I was making. I just rode the real estate up. I said, how would you feel about buying houses for your people? Um, as a landlord, you've got an unbelievable supply of people that need houses, and culturally, you've got a reason to want to help them. And I said, you could work that out, start buying houses close to the reserve, but not try to get everybody on. I said, that, and you could use your training and education and your businesses to help them, make sure they got good payments. If you wanted, you could do something attractive like develop a real estate corporation where if they were living in that type of house that they would actually have shares and could make dividends and, they'd get some kind of ownership. I said that would be probably the most helpful thing that you could do for a family. And 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 then the second thing I think you could do is, I said I'm in my early 60s. I don't know how many more years I'll work. It'll be health driven. I'll just keep going. I don't have to work. I like what I do, and it's good for the cause. And so there's lots of good reasons there. But I said I'd be looking at guys like me with businesses. I got 15 people working for me, and you know, eventually I'm going to want to transition into a quieter life, but those businesses generate annual income like the Seminoles figured out bingo can keep kicking it back to you, steady stream of periodic payments and start buying those businesses to put your people in to work and get managerial training so they can get better jobs than just retail clerks and and put them into your houses and you know if you think about somebody like Warren Buffett, a lot of the folks that you're working with, if you've heard of Warren Buffett, one of the most successful investment people ever. And I would consider him a really high-ranking chief because he gave it all away, $38 billion, one of the biggest donations ever. But he did that in a lifetime. And if I were to throw our crazy, especially in your part of the world, Rachel, your crazy seventh generation thinking, could you imagine if you did that, what I just told you about for 7 generations? Honestly, you'd own it all. You'd be a political force. I mean, everything you wanted, but it's not going to happen for you in the cycle of dependency that you're in if you're, a status Indian. And I said, in closing, I said, you're going to push back though, because like me, you think I don't buy houses in my own territory, and that it's my territory. That's what I'm going to inherit. But in thinking like that, it's just a barrier to all the good stuff that can be happening. And realistically, looking at it just a little bit differently. So we're buying houses and businesses. We're a political and economic force that has to be listened to, and starts to really, you know, bring our different cultures together. We got a better chance of cultural survival, and we haven't given up anything. You still have your rights and title. You still have your territory. And you can still deal with that stuff politically. How do we get more governance? How do we share in the taxation? All of that stuff. So it's like a parallel universe, and I think the Seminoles for me were just that was like my aha moment. That this is the way. We do have to get involved, get in the game, as the Seminoles have said. We can't just yell at the game. We don't like the game. We're not playing the game. That gets us more missing and murdered Indigenous women and less housing, and numbers continue to change. You know what I mean? It's just like that's the cycle that we're trying to break.
Yeah, I like your perspective. Like, I think that's also, in hearing you in real time, that is also something that I deeply resonated with. Of, you are thinking this optimistic and this forward, future oriented thinking that is solutions oriented versus problem fixated. And I think that is why we're still in a lot of the pain that we are. As you know, I'm saying this broadly, but a lot of the work I'm striving to do, and I know the work you're doing, like, I am striving to have these conversations, and through the work I do, to break cycles so that we can be self-determined. Like, what does this self-determination and sovereignty really mean if we're not actualizing it, if we're not integrating and embodying it from within? And that's the lens that I take, is more of that internal healing, but then actioning on that. And so I really, really align with your mindset, your mentality, and again, the case study of the Seminole tribe of Florida was really, really inspiring to me because it it shows us what is possible. And I think that's really important for us to have hope. And yeah, maybe I won't see the change in this lifetime, and the potential, and maybe you won't either, but we can do our part in advancing that forward. And I think yeah, what you've illuminated for us today, and I know we could continue talking, and I have so many other questions I could ask, and perhaps there's a part two that comes if you'd be open to it. But um, as we wrap up, I first of all, I'm going to link the two books in the show notes. Like I said, everyone needs to read both the books. They're very easy to read. They're packed with so much knowledge and information. And like I said, you break it down in simplistic terms for someone like myself who does not understand, like that is not a world I'm not well versed in a lot of the subject matter that you touch on in the book, but it helped me. It lit things up within me that were like, ooh, right, like okay, yeah, like the wheels are turning here. Where can we find you in your work? Because I know a large part of your work is through the Indigenous corporate training and your signature program, working effectively with Indigenous peoples. So, until we have our second part of the conversation, where can people find you in the meantime?
Time. Yeah, they can check us out. Just Google Indigenous Corporate Training and Bob Joseph. I should be fairly shamelessly marketed on the internet, largely because we have a blog with over 600 articles on it that and many questions that we get from people, Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, so there's lots of helpful information there. And I have some social media stuff, Instagram, YouTube is going to be my big push this year. And um, Facebook, I like to Facebook too. Although, although I don't do many new friends on Facebook, but on LinkedIn, very professional. We do try to respond to people there as well. And so, yeah. And in terms of like a second talk, maybe you can ask your listeners to send you questions, and you know we could dive into some of those questions as well, or continue to answer yours. I think we've really just scratched the surface a little bit. I liked your thoughts. Really does just begin with a decision, right? The Seminoles, it came down to a decision. We can't wait for somebody to come and save us. It's just not going to happen, not in the time frame that we need it to. And so it's really down to us make the decision to change and to do something about it. I think that's such a valuable nugget to take out of all of this, and I'm thankful that you took it. And yeah, we don't have to wait 25 years or our turn for self-government. We can look for our freely chosen, start those conversations now. In my personal instance, I'm going to worry about my family and supporting my family, and then we'll start working with the other families. We call them namimas, and so we'll start talking to the not namimas, that's families, and that we'll just start to build out from the bottom up, and that is really the collective way of thinking, at least in Kwakwaka'wakw culture. So that's my commitment, and try to do this and learn from other people, and yeah, so it's been really great to share, and hopefully people take a lot away from it.
There's so much to take away. Yeah. One more question. And I end every conversation this way. So if I don't ask it, it would be very off brand. What does it mean to you to be a cycle breaker?
Oh, what does it mean? Well, it's just we're looking after the people if we're breaking the cycle, and it's because we're in the cycle. And I've even said that to our learners, non-Indigenous learners. Like, I didn't know this. Like, this is outrageous. And I've said, with my stuff, I said sometimes I feel like Morpheus in the Matrix. Take the blue pill and everything stays the same. Take the red pill and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole really goes. And all I'm really offering is a choice. So I think that's what it takes to be a cycle breaker. The blue pill is easy, and it feels comfortable and it's safe, and you think it's supposed to be doing something. That's why I'm always amazed, I'll see some of the strongest sort of woman warriors amongst all of our nations talking about water protection and stuff like that. And, in one breath, and then in the next one, they're talking about now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go register my kid, right? It's like, no, no, you know what? You got to name you have the inherent right, God-given, creator-given, whoever that is for you. You have the right to name your kids, whether they're on an Indian Act list. It's to me, that's just like, where I can tell exactly where a person is when I see that, right?
Mm.
And
Wow.
we just need to we just need to see that and go, oh, this is what they want me to do. Fight to get more people on the list. I see a lot of chatter going on. You probably do too. If you're following Indigenous issues about, the new bill and reinstating Indians, and I'm like, totally the wrong fight. The fight is just over here. Let's name our people. Let's look after our families. Let's make the decision to get in the game and support each other. And you know, and but we're just senators, and man, it's just, to me, it's like, no, still in the cycle. We're still in the cycle, and I even looking at, like I was saying, the AFN national chiefs are, there's no real process. You get elected by your people to be a band chief, and it's only the band chiefs that sit at where I know the Haudenosaunee have their traditional leadership, and that's the freely chosen that we need to get to, and as long as we are we're still in the cycle. The prime minister, will look at what's easiest to go to, the Assembly of First Nations, and we'll talk to the national chiefs, but they're elected by the chiefs who are, elected by band councils, and it's just, I think we talk about it. Matthew Kuhncom it ran for national chief, Assembly of First Nations, fiery rhetoric. I'm going to take on the government. He saw that we needed to, and I love Matthew. I've talked to him a few times, and he's like, he got in there though, and within 2 or 3 years, his budget went from 36 million to 7 million because he was taking on the system, right? He was talking about the system, the hand that was feeding the assembly, and they just, it was just, you could see the budget going, "Oh," they don't fund you to talk to them, and or talk bad about them, so that's some of the change, and it's, for me, it's like we're in this interesting time, like a transition period, where a lot of the band chief and counselors who've become part of these regional organizations. I was talking to my dad about this just the other day. I said, they're all your friends, you guys, that's what you had to work with. You did a great job. But that, if we're going to be true to ourselves, that's not who we're supposed to be talking to about territory and resources and treaty rights. Those are part of the system. And so I said, I told my dad, I'm really struggling with, to try to get us to where we got to go. I got to start to talk about people that have been your friends for 30 years, who are in an organization that was created under a society that doesn't even have any Section 35 rights, and they have all of the political influence, and they're not giving up the funding they're getting to move us to self-government. I mean, that's, just me talking to my dad during the Christmas break. And I said, that's my conundrum. And we do talk about really heavy stuff like that, right? And it's so I'm trying to be sensitive to, your relationships. And he's like, yeah, yeah, I can see that. He really he said it really is. Yeah, that's the next step. So, and that was, and the book I largely wrote for non-Indigenous peoples, but it turns out Indigenous peoples are really curious too and have the same questions. And I was hoping that I could get lots of non-Indigenous peoples to say, yeah, I'm going to read this and maybe get involved and try to push for change in my sphere of influence, and so that was like 21 things. They just got to know about the Indian Act that none of them know, and I'll go back and I'll just close on this, promise. Um, as I was going through the blogging process, I was trying to learn how to be a better blogger. So I just read an article, how to be a better, Googled it, how to be a better blogger. How can I be a better blogger? And the Google advice was, people like lists. So if you can write a list of something, they'll read lists. Your list should be 7 to 10 bullet points long, and that's probably the most favored kind of content. And I thought, 7 to 10. What's my list? What could I list about? Because I'm all history, right? And I thought my aha moment was the Indian Act. Whenever I do my awareness or my work in effectively training, they don't know about the Indian Act and the impacts, and even our own people don't. Sometimes they're so in the system they just can't see it. Yeah, they haven't started to take the red pill, and so I thought that's what I'll talk about. They banned potlatches. They tried to get rid of all of our women. All of the things that that we know of and have experienced, taking away our kids, and I broke the rule though. I just kept my head down, kept plunking, and looked up, and it was 21. And I thought about it, 7 to 10. I thought, nah, I'm going 21. And I, hit enter. And that that blog post, that was over 6 years ago now, got over 50,000 visitors just from Facebook came to read that blog post. That's typically how a blogger does things. You have that piece of content, you amplify it with social media, try to get people onto your website, and so 50,000 people, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, they were, and I thought, wow, a viral post. This is interesting. And the next month, 50,000 more people from Facebook, and the next month, 50,000 more people. And so I thought, I wonder if there's a book writing opportunity here. And honestly, this is for your listeners. I'm a shameless marketer. I'm trying to get people to buy the training. It lets me do all of this work, right? To write about self-government. And so I thought, I wonder if there's, and I said to, the team, somebody reach out to the book publishing people, see if, that this is, you know, an idea that could be pursued. And, we got a call back from page two. We went to a meeting with them and I said, hey, I got this idea for a book. I think it could be another channel of marketing, to get people to maybe take our course, maybe a small percentage of them. Um, but it's about the Indian Act. It's an article about 21 things you don't know about the Indian Act. It's had, just thousands and thousands, and it's a viral post for us. And I can remember Trina at page two said, Bob, we've been in this industry a long time now, whether it's this company or others, but we've got lots of authors. They're really great storytellers, or they're really great technical writers, or there's some combination of the two. And almost all of them don't have what you have right now. And I said, what's that? They said, an idea that people are interested in what you're going to write about. That they don't have. Usually they don't have. They want to tell their story and they're open to help us amplify. And so we think you should publish. And we think it'll go viral in bookstores just like it did online. It'll just take a lot longer. But we would recommend that you start writing, because at that point it was still just 21 paragraphs in a blog post, And so we expanded it out, and that turned out to be a pretty good decision, to write that 21 things. I think, 100 and 150,000 hard copies, and then there's, ebooks and audiobooks and that kind of stuff, probably 170,000 copies out there. And it's in universities and colleges and all kinds of really great things. But yeah.
I'm grateful you wrote it. I'm grateful that yeah, this is available to us, and I really hope that this conversation today supports all the endeavors. Everything's going to be linked in the show notes, so anyone listening can just easily click and find more about all of your work, your books, and I'm just again so grateful for your time, your energy, your wisdom. And until our next conversation, we say Bama P. So chat soon.
Halakasla.